we're now going to move to the sculpture of the Miegeville portal. Now, the Miegeville portal is the south portal of St. Sernin. Usually, when we're talking about the tympanum sculpture of a Romanesque church, we're usually talking about the west portal, the west side of the church, the entrance that is opposite the altar end. However, there's a reason why the south portal is given pride of place and has the most elaborate sculptural decorations at St. Sernin. They face the road not only to the center of town, but it faces the road to the place where St. Sernin was martyred. Now, St. Sernin, his Latin name is Saturninus. Now, St. Sernin was the first bishop of Toulouse, and he was martyred by being tied to a bull and dragged to death. So all these centuries later, the 11th and early 12th century, this is probably dates from the early 12th century, all these centuries later, the clergy is still remembering, of course, their saint, their titular saint for their church. And this is the most elaborately decorated doorway to St. Sernin. At the top, we see a tympanum, and that is the curving area above the doorway, a kind of lunette. And there is portrayed the Ascension of Christ. Now, I might mention that we usually just say the Ascension, just like we say the crucifixion or the nativity. Because we're talking about Christian art, it is assumed that you know that this is the Ascension of Christ, the crucifixion of Christ, the nativity of Christ. So here we have the Ascension. There's also some sculpture on the capitals of the columns that are next to the door, what we call the jambs. And then up on either side of the archway, and you can see that as the arch curves over, you have what is a kind of triangle with a curving side in the wall area. That's called a spandrel. And you have two statues attached to the wall. One is St. James, and one is St. Peter. Now, before I go any further, let me just go over some terminology. We just mentioned spandrels. But let me show you what you call different parts of a portal. When you look at this diagram, you see right in the middle of the doorway a doorway post. It's called a trumeau. And oftentimes there is sculpture on the trumeau, and so we'll talk about trumeau sculpture. And then on either side of the doorway, there's a series here of columns or colonnettes, engaged columns that are attached to the wall. These are the jambs. And once again, sometimes there will be sculpture on the jambs. Above the doorpost, above the trumeau, we see a horizontal beam. It's called a lintel. And above that is this half circle called a tympanum. As I say, it's a lunette shape or a half circle shape above the doorway. And then you can see the arches that go around, and actually they're repeated arches. And they are made up of wedge-shaped blocks that are known as voussoirs, obviously a French term. And then there is the molding that surrounds the archway, and these blocks of the molding are called the archivolts. So now we want to look at those sculptures in the spandrels. You're looking at a picture of St. James. And St. James is on the left side, but if you're thinking about the image of Christ, which is in the center of the tympana, St. James would be on Christ's right. And when they're arranging sculpture or paintings and deciding where to put the different figures, there is a kind of codification. The right side, in other words, Christ's right, so it'd be the viewer's left, is the more honored side. Sometimes you'll have a last judgment. And as we will see, the blessed, the people who are going to heaven, are on Christ's right, and the people going to hell are on Christ's left. Or even when it's not good and bad, you have the most important figure on the right and the less important figure on the left. For example, in some Last Judgments, you'll have Mary on the right and John the Baptist on the left of Christ. But of course, you have to reverse those for the way the viewer is looking. So it is our left, but Christ's right. So St. James is on the Christ's right, and that's rather unusual, because the other figure is St. Peter, and usually St. Peter is considered to be the more important apostle, and he's usually put on Christ's right. So why is James on the left, on our left, Christ's right? There's a reason. Remember where this church is. It's a church on the pilgrimage road to Santiago. Its fame and its importance have to do with its location. And remember that Santiago is Saint James, just the Spanish for Saint James. So Saint James is given the more honored place on the right. Now we're looking at Saint Peter. And Saint Peter is on the other side, so it would be Christ's left. But he's still, we've only have these two apostles. Why did they pick these two? Why were they so important? I mean, Peter's important. Well, there is a reason that has been suggested, and it is in the, I guess you would say, the politics of the time. The clergy at St. Sernin were Augustinian canons, or canons regulars. And this is an order that is priests who say Mass, and they're very frequently saying Masses for the souls of the dead or for some other purpose. Now, there was a very important order of monks. Became extremely important in the 12th century, but was already important in the 11th century. And this was the Cluniac order. And they are based in the town of Cluny in Burgundy, and we'll hear about them and the architecture is associated with them very shortly. But these very powerful order of monks expanded. And they would go off and found daughter houses, in other words, other monasteries that then would be beholding to the main foundation at Cluny. And they also sometimes would take over existing monasteries or existing abbeys or churches. Now, sometimes the monks wanted them to come in and do it, and sometimes they didn't. And in this case, the Augustinian canons wanted to remain Augustinian canons. They did not want to become Cluniac monks, and they fought back. There was an attempt at what we might call a hostile takeover, using modern business terms, and they succeeded. The Pope prevented a Cluniac takeover. They appealed to the Pope, and the Pope said, "No, Cluny, you can't take St. Sernin. They can continue to be Augustinian canons." So one of the ideas is that Peter is here because Peter refers to the Pope. Peter was the first bishop of Rome, and it is the Bishop of Rome who is called the Pope. And so that this is in honor of the good deed that the Pope did for the canons regular of St. Sernin. At least that's one idea. Peter, of course, is an important saint, and there could be other reasons that they picked him, but I thought that was interesting. One thing I want you to do when you're looking at this sculpture is look at the drapery folds and how they are carved and how they are created. That is one way that art historians try to determine who carved these statues, or later on, who painted these paintings. We talk about attributing a work of art to a particular artist. And the way we do it is by comparing the style, and especially little details, with the artist's documented works. Now, in the Middle Ages, we don't always know who created these works. We don't always have a particular name attached to the sculpture. In this case, we have the name Gelduin. But many times there'll be the artist who worked at the tympana at whatever the church is, say the church at Cluny, and maybe one of his workshop then became the master who worked at Vézelay, things like this. And they can trace style and influence and sometimes workshops this way. Certainly it's not just drapery folds, it's the way all of the different parts are created. But that is one thing that I like to point out to people, because sometimes students don't think of looking at drapery folds or the way the hair is carved, or just little details. So now we want to look at the tympana itself. This is the Ascension tympana of the Miegeville portal at St. Sernin in Toulouse. And Hearn has attributed this to Gelduin. Remember Bernard Gelduin, or Gelduinus? He was the artist who carved his name, said, "May fetch it, I made this," on the edge of the altar at St. Sernin. And the style of the carvings on the edge of the altar are so similar to the styles of the ambulatory reliefs, what we call the plaque style, that it is believed that it was Bernard Gelduin and his workshop who created those reliefs of the Christ in Majesty, the angels, the two apostles that we've already seen. They're now encased in the ambulatory of the Church of St. Sernin and the East End. And we don't know where they were originally placed. We just really quickly mentioned a lot of different theories about that, which of course I'm never going to test you on, because who knows? But according to Hearn, and Hearn, it's M.F. Hearn, who wrote a book called Romanesque Sculpture. He called the style of the tympana at St. Sernin the maturity of the Gueldina style. And he believed that the figures carved here in the upper part of the tympana, Christ and the angels, are by the master's hand himself. Generally, when you have when you are working on a huge enterprise like creating the sculpture for a church, you would have a master mason, and you would also have assistants, and we call this the workshop, the people that he has trained. And very often they will follow the style of their master, and they may change things. So this is probably by the Gelduin workshop, and probably these very important figures of Christ and the angels at the top, carved by the master himself. And to show you this, I want to compare one of the angels from the ambulatory with one of the angels from the tympanum. Now, you can see there's both similarities and differences. They're both in low relief. And there are some similarities in the way the draperies are carved. If you look at the skirt, as it were, of the angels, you have this arc that goes down at the edge of the overgarment, and the edge is created by having a raised section of the stone, and then it's carved away on either side. So it looks like a kind of raised band. And then you have curving shapes that are either carved directly into the stone, and they leave a bit of a ridge, and kind of a double ridge for each drapery fold. And then if you look at things like the hair and the wings of the angels, there's some similarities. You remember we said in the ambulatory it looked like almost like geometric shapes, almost like tile work or something for the hair and for the angel wings. And it's a little freer now. The angel wing feathers have some variety. They are not exactly identical, and the same thing with the hair. It looks like sort of, circular forms, but there's a little more three-dimensionality. They look a little less like a cap. Now, What Heron suggests is that the artist is developing. You'll remember that the church was consecrated in 1096. And so we associate the plaques and the altar with this consecration. Presumably they were done by that time, so late 11th century. And then we think the tympana is a little later, probably early 12th century. And if the same artist and his workshop are continuing to work, what Hearn says is that their style has developed. It's changed a bit. Now, think about it for a minute. We said that there seems to have been a period in which large-scale sculpture, stone sculpture on churches, had pretty much died out. And now, with these new Romanesque churches, they're creating large-scale stone sculpture. So what are they using for models? What are they using for training? One idea is that they were based on things like book covers, ivory book covers from the Ottonian era or the Carolingian era, or even possibly Byzantine that came over to the West. That in the church, in the scriptorium, there may have been some models, which could have been ivory or metalworking. And that's why we have that plaque style. They're so shallow, as though they were a book cover that had been translated and enlarged in stone. But the idea goes that if the artist starts out by doing this, being perhaps heavily indebted to small-scale sculpture, as he creates these larger stone works, he may realize that there are more possibilities. And his work may develop, and as we can see, becomes much more lively and less static, less rigid. Of course, it may also have something to do with the subject matter. The subject matter of the Ascension, a miracle. Christ is rising up to heaven. That's an exciting subject. So maybe the artist wanted to imbue it with more action, more movement, and is able to because he has been developing. He's been learning new techniques and becoming more secure in them, and now can be a bit freer. So these are the differences. When we look at, for example, the angel, and we said that the shapes of the feathers on the top part of the wings have a little bit more variety. They're not so rigidly geometric. And some of them vary from one another. And we look at the hem of the drapery of the angel's garment, and it's agitated. It has all sorts of action and movement, and suggests liveliness and energy. And of course, the angel's gesture, he's not confined to the shape of this arch, although certainly he's confined to the shape of the block, but the arm is reaching up, which is appropriate for the subject. He's pointing up to heaven where Christ is going, but it also gives you more energy, more liveliness. I might want to point out that they're holding an almost identical cross in almost identical way that the arm is bent, except for the angel in the ambulatory, he's got his two fingers pointed out, and for the angel of the tympana, he's showing all of his fingers. Well, let's look more closely at this tympana. Remember the subject of the Ascension of Christ. We've seen this several times in art before. We've seen, for example, the Drogo Sacramentary with a little manuscript painting within an initial. And Christ is striding up a hill and reaching up, and the hand of God is coming down from a cloud to grasp his hand and presumably pull him up into heaven. That comes out of early Christian art. And we've seen a marble relief of the Ascension and the resurrection, shown as the Mary's coming to the tomb. And at the top of that relief from about 400 or maybe early 5th century, we see this heavy-jawed Christ striding up the hill and reaching up, and the hand of God is coming down to him. Well, that's sort of the early Christian type of ascension. And, of course, we know that the Carolingian artists often had models from earlier manuscripts, so it is preserved in that 9th century manuscript. Lots of works of art no longer exists. So we don't know exactly what Geldwin was looking at. We're saying, there are similar things out there in the world today. There may have been models that were right there at St. Sernin, either in the scriptorium or maybe survival of classical sarcophagus or something that no longer exists today. We just don't know. Okay, second type of ascension. Think about the Rabula Gospels. Christ is in the sky. He's rising up to heaven. He's facing the viewer. He's frontal, as we say, and he's surrounded by angels. In a way, this particular relief of the Ascension combines both of those. Christ is turning to one side, looking up, like early Christian and, as we saw, Carolingian examples. And yet he's surrounded by the angels, like the Byzantine example. His arms are raised almost like an orant figure from the early Christian period. It may or may not have something to do with prayer, because the prayer gesture was a bit different by the 12th century, the more familiar gesture of putting your hands together, for example, which is actually how you pay homage to a lord. But at any rate, the arms are raised, and the arms are going up to heaven. They're pointing the direction that Christ is going. And you can see the angels on either side have their arms raised and are pointing up toward heaven. Sort of our eyes are being visually drawn upward, along with, as we have to imagine, the body of Christ rising up to heaven. But there he is, looking up and going up in a, I guess we'd say, a metaphorical sense. He's still there in the tympanum. Now, look at the feet where the angels and Christ are standing. There's these kind of rounded blocks, almost like upside-down U's. And they could be representing a mountain range. We know that we know that the Bible says that Christ ascended from Mount Olivet. Or perhaps they're supposed to represent clouds. Sometimes a little hard to tell. And if they do represent clouds, then Christ is already going up toward heaven, rather than just being ready to start. And that makes a certain amount of sense when we look down below, which we'll do in just a moment. First, let's take a look at these angels. You've got two angels who are carved out of the same block that Christ is carved, and they're sort of right up next to him, almost like they're supporting him. And then you have two larger angels, and then on either side, and then two angels who are leaning inward so that they fit within the shape of the tympana, this curving shape. And we want to talk about that in a moment. Down below, on the lintel, we can see all of these little figures. And they look kind of short and stubby. And their head is at a very odd angle. It's turned so far back, it's literally, parallel to their shoulders. I'm not quite sure whether you can do that, but it certainly gives you the idea of looking up. And that is because these are the 12 apostles. There's 12 figures and two extras on either end who look a little bit different, and we'll talk about them in a minute. But there are the 12 apostles looking up to heaven, looking up to see Christ going up to heaven. Now, if you remember from Acts 1, verse 10, two men in white, whom we interpret as angels, speak to the apostles. And they say, "Men of Galilee, Why are you staring up to heaven? Why are you looking up to heaven? Don't you know that he, Christ, will come again as he went? Well, that's a very important verse, not only for showing how do we represent the ascension, where they often have those two angels. Sometimes they're leaning down from heaven. Sometimes they're standing down on the ground with the apostles, as you may remember from the Ribula Gospels. And it is suggested that those two figures on either end, one of whom you can see is holding a scroll, that these may represent the men in white, presumably angels, who say, "Men of Galilee, why are you looking up to heaven?" Now, the other reason that that verse is so important is because it says, don't you know that as he went, he's going to come back the same way, is the implication. And so when artists are portraying the second coming of Christ, they often use the ascension as a kind of model. And sometimes people will actually argue about whether a work of art is an ascension or is a second coming, or, what is it? And sometimes we think that the implication is there, that you're supposed to think about these different verses and kind of had multiple layers of meaning, perhaps. Okay, we said these guys are short and stubby. They fit into the space of the lintel. We talked about the angels who are sort of fitting into the curve of the tympanum. And so one of the things you're going to notice in Romanesque art is that the figure shapes and their sizes correspond to their placement in the architecture. They fit in the space available. And it's often said that Romanesque sculpture is subordinate to architecture. That you've just got to, fit the figures in however they go. As we'll see later on, when we look at the next period that's erroneously called Gothic art, but that term is so entrenched. When we look at the Gothic style, you'll see that the sculpture starts to detach itself, in a sense, from the architecture. Rather than everything squished to fit, you have perhaps more natural sizes. Sometimes they're smaller, but the proportions are nice. Proportions are more real. And you'll have things like, I say, a Trumeau statue that almost could be a separate statue taken off the Trumeau, unless you looked at the back and saw it wasn't finished up there. But we're going to notice this change, but not yet. Romanesque sculpture, you'll often see that the figures they almost seem like they're crowded in sometimes, and they fit the shape of the architecture, which is certainly a valid architectural choice. I'm not trying to say that one is good and one is bad. Please don't do that. I love Romanesque sculpture. So here we're looking at details of Christ rising up to heaven and of one of the angels. And you can, once again, see the drapery folds. You notice with Christ, he not only has that curving form that is the edge of the bottom edge of the overgarment, but the curving shapes of the fold within actually turn up a little bit more. It's a little, I don't want to say hook, it's not quite that, but just a little extra energy, a little extra curve at the end. And you can also see that his the fold of his overgarment is actually a bit more three-dimensional. So if Heron is right, and this is Geldwin, he has developed. He's making his figures a little more lively with these drapery folds, a little bit more three-dimensional. They're still fairly low relief, but they have certain sections that are more deeply cut and taking on a kind of new liveliness. And we'll see what other artists do, going perhaps even further and making things perhaps even agitated. But here was just, a little bit more liveliness that he had with the plaque style of the ambulatory. Now, I want to show you one more sculpture that was from St. Sernin. It's actually now in the museum, the Augustinian Museum in Toulouse. And that is a sculpture a relief of two women. One is holding a lion on her lap, and the other is holding a ram on her lap, a male sheep. And this also has, as you can see, letters carved in the background, and the letters, of course, are in Latin, and it says Signum Leonis, which means the sign of the lion. And we believe that these date from the early 12th century. It doesn't look like Gueldine's plaque style. What it does look like is sculpture that we already saw at Santiago. And you remember on the jambs, or on the wall next to the jambs, of the Puerta de las Plateras at Santiago, we saw some of these sculptures which had these elongated figures with the crossed legs. And here I'm showing you David. David at Santiago playing, it doesn't look like a lyre. It looks like some other kind of stringed instrument with a bow. And he's in this very characteristic position with the crossed legs. And lo and behold, these two women have exactly the same pose. The draperies are made in the same fashion with these repeated raised sections of the curved draperies that are quite close to each other, rather than having a lot of stone without drapery folds in between. And the legs are crossed in exactly the same manner, and they're both elongated in the same way. When we say something's elongated, it means that they're sort of stretched out. Proportionally, the heads are small in relationship to the body, so these are sort of tall, thin figures. And they are fitting, as you can see with David, presumably in the space that was allotted to him. We don't have the space of where the women were, because as I say, they're now in the museum, but presumably they fit into the architectural space. It's so close. We do say that the same sculptor, or at least his workshop, worked both at Santiago and at Toulouse. And, this makes a certain amount of sense. Masons would travel to where the job was. If someone was building a new church, they would come and they would stay there for as long, probably for years in some cases, as long as it took. The people who were actually building the architecture, they might be there for most of their life. Who knows? It depends on how fast the work goes. Is the money coming in, and all these different things that determines how quickly you can put up a building, which takes a lot of time. Some of them have many different building campaigns. Some of them, put up the building as they say, in one campaign. But the Masons and their workshops, we believe, did travel the pilgrimage roads, just as the pilgrims did, but also, to secure jobs in different areas. So here is another example of that.